Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are. If you're joining us, it's such a pleasure to welcome you once again to another conversation in the Pan-African Forum series. We've been having a series of online conversations amplifying African perspectives on a range of social, economic, and political issues, really thinking about what it means to organize from the basis of the identity of being African. So over the last 9 months, we've been holding conversations on the concept and realities of Pan-Africanism. And tonight, we wind up the panel conversations thinking about what all of this looks like in the here and now, in our 20th and 21st century lives. I hope you have had a great month since we last chatted and that you had an absolutely fantastic Pan-African Women's Day on July 31st. I'm still on a high. My name, by the way, is Mishai Mola, and this series is curated and brought to you by our host institutions, the Alliance Francaise, the Elephant.info, and IFRA Nairobi. And it is such a privilege to hold this space. We are thrilled to have you join us if you are on the Zoom webinar, and also those of you joining us by live stream on YouTube. Karibuni sana. If you haven't had a chance to catch the 9 conversations that we've had before, all of these are archived either at the elephant.info on the website, but also on the YouTube channels of our hosts, Alliance Francaise de Nairobi, as well as on the Elephant under the playlist of the Pan-African Forums. If you are joining us at this moment, please note that you can chat, and we look forward to following your chats. We've got a lot of the conversations. Some of the threads we followed in these conversations has come out of the chat. So Karibuni, please feel free to join us on the chat. Karibuni meaning welcome in Kiswahili. And also, if you are on YouTube, if you put your comment or your question in the chat there, somebody will make sure that we harvest them and bring them into this conversation. I suggest that if you have a question, please put it on the Q&A. That makes it easier for us to highlight it. And while we will come, hopefully, and be able to also bring in some of the comments, it will be the questions that we will privilege in terms of the conversation. So please put that in the Q&A so that I see it. Let me just take a moment to welcome all our panelists today and to invite each of them just to say hello to you and to each person. And today, I just have such a privilege of being in conversation with these 4 women who, in their own ways, each personally inspires me. So I'm so thrilled. Guys, can you tell I'm thrilled to have you on? So let me start by Stephanie Wanga, who is joining us from London in the UK. Stephanie is our academic today on the panel. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
And then we have Mkawasi Mcharo Hall. I'm going to start with the people who are furthest from me. Mkawasi comes to us from Baltimore in the US. She's an artist, educator, activist, and we'll come to all of that in a few minutes. But Mkawasi, right now, karibu.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Also in Nairobi, like me, let me start with Udwak Amimo. Udwak is a journalist, and I cannot tell you, I've been boasting to everybody all week that I am going to be interviewing Udwak because she's usually the one asking all the questions. So Udwak, it is such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Mshai. Thank you for inviting me to this important conversation.
And then we have Njeri Kabeberi, who's also with us in Nairobi. Njeri, I am just getting used to associating you with Nairobi. I know you spent a long time in South Africa. And I was just sharing with all the panel that Njeri is one of the people who inspired me on the path that I have been on, who reminded me that no matter what else you do, you must have a foot in activism and making sure that the world is better. So Njeri, it is such a joy to have you also join us.
Thank you, Mushai, and hello, everybody. Very happy to be here.
And so now in the first 4 conversations of the series, for those who have joined us, we really wanted to look at the history of and the roots of Pan-Africanism, to understand the concept itself, to begin to look at some of the questions that drive it, and just get a sense of what do we mean when we say Pan-Africanism. And then we had several conversations on some of the issues that we thought deserved a deep dive. And I really want to thank anybody who joined us in those conversations, who asked questions, who put in their comments, who sent us text messages, because it was you who really shaped some of the questions and issues that we looked at in the following 5 conversations, ranging from the question of language to asking about how Pan-Africanism and feminism are in conversation with each other, to looking at the place of the economy, of education. And last time we looked at what does activism look like? And in today's conversation, we want to bring this all together by looking at how it manifests in individual lives. And reminding ourselves that all these things we talk about are worked through by individual people picking up the mantle and people saying, I will step up and do what I need to do. But we also want to look at the future and the vision, if I may term it this way, of the generations of Pan-Africanists who are alive and active today, as we begin to think about the legacy that those of us who are here in the 21st century, in this early part of the 21st century, want to leave for those who will follow us 50 years to come. Now, I know that all of you would probably disavow the mantle of speaking for your generations, but I wonder if we could just begin to explore that question of generational vision through your perspectives, your experiences, and your visions as individuals who are living in this historical moment. But let me first just begin by getting to know you, getting to give all of our participants a chance by asking how all of you got here. Jerry, I'm going to start with you, since I suspect you're going to take us furthest back in time. And you remind us that what we're doing in the 21st century was handed over to us from the 20th century. So I'm going to ask all of you to just share, how did you get to where you are today? What have you been doing? And particularly, how did you begin to engage with this concept of Pan-Africanism? What has your journey been to where you are today? Jerry, may I start with you, please?
Thank you, Mshai. Let me start by saying that it's been a journey. It's been quite a journey. And at some point, I thought it's supposed to be a short journey. I thought you just get into this journey, do one thing, and move on into your life. But I've discovered that it's a lifetime interest, it's a lifetime occupation, and it has been a lifetime journey for me. In fact, I would like to say that nearly all my adult life, I've been an activist. I just found myself doing activism, and I've been. The 80s were very tough years in Kenya, and all the 80s and the 90s were very tough years. So some of us started growing into, I tell people that when you get upset and hate what you're seeing around you, that is where your calling is. And there was so much bad happening, and I was hating it. And I didn't know then that that is my calling, but I started engaging with the women whose mothers, whose sons had been arrested, and also sisters of people who had been arrested. But my moment that really changed my life, I thought it was temporary, but the moment that changed my life was when a student was arrested called Onyango Olo. He was 22 years old. He was about my age. And the university had been closed, shut down, because there had been an attempted coup. And Onyango Olo was going back home to Mombasa, and he was in a train. And there was an army officers in and out of the train. And they were searching things, they were searching bags, they were searching everything, and they searched his bag. And they found an essay that he was supposed to submit. And that essay, they decided that essay was seditious. They just read, army officers, maybe private. They just read and decided it looked like a seditious document. So Olo never reached home in Mombasa. He was taken back to Nairobi and proceeded to be jailed for 4.5 years. Actually for 6 years, but he served 4.5 years. For me, it was such a shock that a 22-year-old, a student at the University of Nairobi, could just be arrested for doing his schoolwork. He was just doing what he was supposed to do. He was doing an assignment. He was supposed to submit the assignment, and he hadn't submitted it. And then I realized, my God, it could happen to me. We are not free. In this country, we are not free. Young people are in danger, you know? And I started then associating. I went to all his hearings. I didn't know him. I went to all his hearings in shock. I went to all his hearings, and the rest, I guess, is history. I just continued to follow. I worked with his sister. I worked with other mothers of political prisoners. I worked with wives of political prisoners. And then later, as you were saying, I joined the mothers of freedom of political prisoners at Freedom Corner here in Nairobi. And that joining the mothers of political prisoners changed my life forever. I was doing corporate, I was employed in the insurance industry. My life changed totally. I never worked again in the corporate world. And I guess my civil society work began that time. One little thing I just also want to mention is that when I joined the mothers of political prisoners, my son was 3 years old. I left him, he was 3. I left him home with his father. And they are the ones who used to come and see me at Freedom Corner. And he's today 33. So you can see how far. He's 33 today, and he was 3 years then. So, and what I want to tell women is, it doesn't matter if you have a child. It doesn't matter if you have a husband. It doesn't matter if you have a job. When the calling comes, it doesn't stop you from doing anything. It didn't stop me. I had a young boy, I had a young son, and I left him. I shouldn't have left him. But when I went to Freedom Corner, I thought I was going for I actually thought I was going for the day. And the mothers were going to be there with their hunger strike forever. But I thought I was going there for a day. But when I wanted to leave, Professor Wangari Maathai told me, no, Njeri, you can't leave. Look, there are no young people here. You're the only one. You have been energizing these women the whole day. What are they going to do when you go? And that was it, Mshai. So when you saw me there, it was one by choice and part not by choice. Professor Wangari Maathai told me, you can't leave us here. So just stay. And I stayed on. And finally, 52 political prisoners were released.
Jerry, I just wanted to clarify for those who don't know what Freedom Corner is and what was happening at that moment. What was the significance of Freedom Corner? And I know you've mentioned Professor Wangari Maathai, you've mentioned the mothers of political prisoners. Could you just tell us just a little bit about when you say Freedom Corner, what was going on then?
Yeah, very interesting. Nairobi has one of the biggest parks. It's called Uhuru Park. Mm-hmm. And it is a leisure park. Everybody goes there to their boat rides. People just take walks. And it's also where the president speaks to people on public holidays or state holidays. And years before the mothers' hunger strike, there had been a plan to build a monument, a huge monument there, 21st century building at Uhuru Park. And single-handedly, Professor Wangari Maathai stopped that building. We didn't understand much about environment. Today I'm an environmental activist. I didn't understand much then. She single-handedly fought the government alone, abused everything that a woman would go through, she went through, but she won the battle. So no building was put there, and Uhuru Park is still there. So years later, when the Mothers' Hunger Strike was organized, knowing that she had saved that park, she organized that the mothers should actually go to Uhuru Park. And then that area where the mothers were, it was just an open area. It was just an open area, an open park. We just went there one day. And that area, she later named it Freedom Corner. And today, everybody, every activist who wants to launch something big goes to Freedom Corner. Professor Wangari Maathai's funeral service was held at Freedom Corner. So it has become the symbol of freedom in this country. And it was made the symbol of freedom by mothers of political prisoners. The youngest was 60 years old, Mushai, and the oldest was 82 years old. That was Miroge Kariuki's mother, one of the political prisoners also. So you can see 82 years old, she just left her home and went for a hunger strike, never knowing how long she was going to stay there. And she stayed, she and another, Koyo Amwere's mother, 2 prisoners, they stayed for a whole year because their children were the last to be released. So 52 political prisoners were released, but those 2 were released last because they were maybe seen to be the most notorious. And Miroge Kariuki's mother, 82 years old, stayed. Okay, the strike changed form from hunger strike to silent strike to different strikes over the year. But she stayed on. At 82, she stayed on for a year. So you can never be too old, nor too young to actually be an activist. Over.
Wow. I mean, that's just amazing. And some of the threads you've drawn, I'm just going to throw out because I think we'll come back to them, is this idea of freedom. And how, when you talk about successive generations of Pan-Africanists, we're always coming back to this question of freedom, whether it means emancipation from enslavement, whether it means independence, whatever form it means. And then the other thing that you said was how things change. You know, the face of activism, what people are doing, who is doing it, how they're doing it, changes over the years, but it comes back to this central issue. And I really want to thank you that, you know, I'm going to come back to later on what you're doing now, because you said you were in the insurance agency and, you know, you were in that part of corporate, and then you went into civil society. And it's amazing to see how these issues, the issues of the environment, the issues of standing up and standing for what is right, became a defining thing throughout your life up to where you are today. But thank you so much, Njeri, for starting us off so well. And so now I'm going to go to the other side of the world. Kawasi, tell us a little bit more about where you came from. What's your beginnings?
So I'm really grateful for Njeri Kabeberi's starting off, because she's put me right where I wanted to start off. Because I think my introduction or awareness of Pan-Africanism and my stepping into Pan-Africanism came from my storytelling. I'm a storyteller. And I remember during the Freedom Corner activism, we were telling a story. And this was my first major play at the Kenya National Theatre. We called it Pambazuka Africa. I co-wrote it and directed it, and we had a large cast. And we were exploring the story of Africa in this play. And it was, it ran for a month. It was packed every day. And it was such a pivotal moment of young people who were beginning to explore their identity as Africans. And I remember the debates we used to have with some of the cast members who would come to me and tell me, I do not think this concentrating on what being an African is important. That our first identity is to be as Christians. And this was interesting because the majority of the cast members, if not all of them, were drawn from churches. We were doing this production through a church drama group called Mavuno. And they were a reflection of the young Kenyans who were there, or the generation, the post-colonial generation, whose identity is not necessarily as a Kenyan, is not first as a Kenyan, it is not first as an African. There is the ethnic identity, and then there is the religious identity, which tends to be fundamental to a lot of Kenyans and Africans, that you're first of all a Christian. So this debate of who am I? Why are you telling me I'm an African when being an African is never something I was taught to be? It came to me through storytelling. So the more after that, I continued writing, I continued directing plays, and I realized all my plays had this bent on telling the African story, whatever the story may be, from a political angle, social angle, stories about love, it all had to do with exploring the African narrative. Just skip to the present. I'm a teacher, I teach culture, I teach geographical, historical ideas on Africa or realities of African nations and African places, especially the East African region. And I teach it through storytelling. Right now, we still have plays going on. I still have symposiums going on. And all the time, it goes back to, who am I as an African? What is my place in this world as an African? Coming from Kenya and into the US, my identity as an African and as a Black person expanded. I was aware of what the first Black diaspora was when I was in college in Kenya through literature, because we studied all the African-American literature, Harlem Renaissance, up from slavery, all those, the poetry and the writing. What I did not know was, of course, the experiential part. So coming to the US and being immersed in the Black culture opened my eyes up to a completely different perspective of what the African was, because this went way back into another place that I wasn't aware of as a Kenyan. Then of course I get to acquire a family that is not within the African people that I know about. This is an African-American family. And suddenly my perspective even deepens even further. So at this point right now, from the first step of exploring who am I as an African when we were so young, what has happened is that I have expanded outward and inward as an African, as a Pan-Africanist, and it's still something I continue to explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Mkabwasi. If I may ask you, you said that first play of yours was called Pambazuka, and I know one of the places that you got to take it by a special request was to the I think at that time it was still OAU headquarters in Addis. What does Pambazuka mean?
It means sunrise, arise. We translated it as arise, Africa. Pambazuka is a Swahili word for sunrise, when the sun is coming out. So the idea was exploring the pessimism that was coming from Africa at that time, because we were in a difficult place. We were aware of resource exploitation. We were aware of the post-colonial oppression. We were aware of where we were as economically, as people who were fighting through poverty. And we wanted to figure out, how do we arise from this? How do we create a sunrise moment for Africa? And one of the most difficult things that were happening after the play, and the audience will come out, is asking, okay, so I'm suddenly aware of this perspective of who I am as an African, and I'm suddenly aware of the big job that needs to be done. What are you telling us we should do? And the answer was always, well, we're storytellers. So we just told your story. You go ahead and figure out what your place is in this whole place about how do you contribute to the sunrise of Africa?
Okay, and of course, you know, I'm just smiling when I think about this. This was the early 90s, so you know, the whole structural adjustment, having to live through that particular period was particularly difficult. But I'm smiling because you're still telling the story, you're still waking up people, you're still getting people to think about these issues. And so I'm going to now come to Uduak. And Uduak, I think everybody all over Africa who's listened to, you've actually been a voice and a face on very many of our local channels as well as international channels, from whether it is Citizen in Kenya, I know, I'm trying to remember the name of the station in Nigeria, but also I think most people would know you from programs like Focus on Africa. BBC, VOA, and the whole bit. So I'm just really interested, this thing of telling the story where Mkabwasi left us. What does it look like? How did you get to be doing what you're doing as a journalist and everything else that you're doing?
How did I? Yeah, actually, the storytelling, the journalism, and the Pan-Africanism intersect. So I'll start with the Pan-Africanism because you I have dual identities. My parents are from different countries and I always traveled. And so from an early age, I was aware of different countries. My internet connection is unstable. If it falls off, I will log back in. I was aware of different countries, but my awareness of being African came to me as a child when we spent time in the US. My mother was studying there. And those of you, Njeri, Mkwasi, you know how it is when you're abroad and, you say you're from Kenya, you're from Namibia, you're from Africa, And so, I always had a sense of being African. And with the way that, family dynamics played out, that was the identity that I clung on to. But also, in terms of the Pan-African awareness, I'm told I have an awareness of being in these Pan-African spaces where for, I wouldn't say babysitting, but for child minding. In the US, my mother was studying, you could call on some sort of African-American collective and leave your child there for, so you're in these spaces. Apparently, I've been to a Bob Marley concert as a child, I don't know. But there were all these, Black Panther, African-American, Black American convenings, which I was exposed to as a child. And so my sense is that, they probably seeped into my consciousness. And so if we then fast forward to the journalism, I had gone into university wanting to be a lawyer. And this is the early 90s where Mkwasi, you're talking about, coming into consciousness as well. I then come into the consciousness because CNN has just launched. This is around the time of the Gulf War. So, there's such detailed reporting of the rest of the world. And the first thing I notice is that when they do the weather report, Africa, the whole continent is just hot. And then they move on. I was like, okay. And then you have the wars, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Somalia. Africa was on fire. And that's the way Africa was covered. But that was not the Africa I was familiar with. I was familiar of, the Africa where you show up and I'll just identify where I'm from in the country. Before you get to the front door of the gate, there's a cup of tea thrust into your hands and you can't leave a home until you've eaten, and various relatives' homes are your homes, you're in and out. And so I was very, disturbed about the way Africa was covered because remember, I've been traveling as well, and all that I experience is, hospitality, delicious food, people trying to feed you till you drop. Yes, we had some excesses. I remember the bodies, many of us will remember the Rwandan genocide and the bodies floating on Lake Victoria, and that we stopped eating fish, for a time during that period. But there were so many other experiences that, contributed to the African experience or the experience of Africa. And so, my first job as a journalist was with Reuters. And that was because they had this magazine program called Africa Journal. And that for me reflected the Africa that I knew in all its complexity, the nuances, everything. It was told, it was unvarnished, but there was also a dignity to the way that people were allowed. There was a dignity to the way people were reflected. And so in my third or fourth year, whenever it was, I had to do an internship, I then said, okay, that's the thing that I'm going to do. And so about, broadcasting to Africa. And then of course, as you do, you decide you want to come home. So I came back and, I've attempted to work locally with varying degrees of success. Here I was on television, hosting a current affairs talk show. But people like you, Mshai, who know me, will know that I'm kind of itching because I miss my Pan-African context. There are things that I think we should be aware of. I suspect that you'll get into this further. I think that our local local medias wherever we find them, whether Kenya, South Africa, wherever we are in the world, there should be some sort of Pan-African conscious, Kawasi was talking about, that there seems to be this tension about, who are you? What is your identity? And it's a question I remember being asked as a child, who are you? Well, my father's from this country, my mother's from that country. Who am I? You don't know how to understand that. And that comes, there's a patriarchal, aspect to that, even within the African context. But, in Africa, I know that here in Kenya, I have been told, nobody cares about my esoteric ideas, of, African liberty and African, I got a headache, you sit down and think about it. And it's not new, because if you go back into history and the various, whether it was colonization, whether it was, slavery, we've always had these moments where people cared and others didn't. How would our brothers and sisters have been taken away from Africa if, we hadn't colluded with some of the people who were taking them away. So that for me has been the dovetailing of the Pan-African experience and the storytelling experience as expressed through the media.
Udoka, I wonder, I know you've worked, many of us, when we tend to contrast between our experiences living and working or studying or whatever on the continent and off the continent in somewhere else in the world, part of what we call global Africa. We're citizens of both. But you've also worked in several stations, both on the continent and on the diaspora. And I'm curious, sometimes, the impression is that if you're on the African continent, wherever you are, we know a lot about each other. We think about Pan-Africanism, perhaps a whole lot more than if you're off the continent. I wonder, what were your impressions about especially working in different parts of in different countries within Africa? Because I think you've had the privilege of doing that very few people have actually had.
Within national contexts, unfortunately, I found rather disappointingly that there wasn't much concern about the rest of Africa beyond whatever border that I found myself in. And that actually is a tension within, the media when people, talk about, media in Africa or African media, and the two are different. They're quite distinct as entities. And so to go somewhere and claim to be, local media and say that you're concerned about what is taking place in the north of Ethiopia, people think you're mad. Okay, that there are more immediate concerns within the boundaries. People, there's been a riot, there's been something or the other. What is happening, on the east side of the continent does not concern us. Actually, to be fair to the Western side, they tend to be more concerned about the rest of Africa than the rest of Africa is more concerned with the rest of Africa. So I found it a harder sell when I've been on this, on the eastern side of the continent, to get people concerned about the rest of the continent. The concern only occurs when you have people fighting the Pan-African Parliament, xenophobia in South Africa, a coup attempt in Ghana or Nigeria, those big headline stories. And the tragedy is that even with that sort of reporting of the continent is filtered through international, correspondence and mediation. We as Africans do not cover Africa for ourselves. Okay? So if I'm local somewhere on the continent, I have to link up to the global platform, CNN, Al Jazeera, somebody or the other, Reuters, AP, to find out what is going on in neighboring Uganda, in Burundi or whatever. If I'm in Kenya, I don't have a correspondent in the rest of Africa. If I'm in Nigeria, I don't have a correspondent in the rest of Africa. It's too expensive, is what people will tell you. And people don't care, is what they'll say.
And I'm asking that because I think a lot of times when we talk even about Pan-Africanism, we end up focusing on our own issue and saying, as long as it's an African issue, because it's what I am invested in my community, that's what the focus is. And then saying, and it happens elsewhere. And I think one of the things that we'll be segueing to in a few minutes is to ask about what is Pan-African about the issues and the priorities and the work that we've been doing. And I think all of you have been doing such amazing work, bringing that concept to the center of the work that you do. Stephanie, I wanted to pick up on what Uduak just said. And you're one of, I find what you do really interesting because yes, we need to know the specificities of local context. And you know, the whole thing that we laugh about, Africa is a country, and no, Africa is not a country. But at the same time, it's also important for us to use, there's a reason that we use this concept where we try to say we are connected. Just, you know, in terms of what Uduak has just been saying, I've been so frustrated in the last few days trying to find out about what's going on in Haiti and trying to get the details of that. And number one, it's all filtered, as you said, through Western media. But number two, it seems that so few people, I mean, all our eyes are on Afghanistan, and I think rightly so, but it seems that people are, you know, are missing the tragedy and everything that's going on in Haiti. And so this idea of how we both look at the specificities, but also think about this, the whole concept of Africa. And I know you've been, you did a degree in African studies, right? And so I'm just interested in how you have got to where you are and why you're interested in these, in looking at the big picture, even as we look at the small specific pictures.
Yeah, well, it's a big question, but also a good one. I think that mine started, you know, as some of the others here, with art. And I think for me, art is what gave me politics, right? So it started with the art forms that I really, really loved the most, which is music and books. And so I start to look at the thing about art is that there's two key things, I think. There's memory and then there's imagination, right? So when I read books or when I heard these songs or when I saw my dad dancing and my uncles and my aunties, you could see they're almost remembering something, or there's something being celebrated there. And there's also in the same breath something being imagined in a lot of art in general. And so that made me curious about kind of the worlds that they were living in as they danced or in the books that I read. And so that made me curious about history. And history in turn made me curious about politics, because politics animates history. And so it was this weird journey from art to history to politics to understand what's going on, the world that came before and the world that might come after. And so that, I think, was the beginning of my journey into politics and history. But then as I start to read art from the rest of the continent, I realized there's so many echoes, so much sounds so similar, so much sounds connected and linked. You know, I read Aikwe Ama's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, and he might have written that about Kenya. Do you know? And so there's so many links that I realize. Maybe there's also historical links, because there's always, I think, at least a morsel of truth in art. And so I look at the historical links between these countries. I look at the political links between these countries, and then I realize, my gosh, our histories are so tied to each other that I don't see how our future can't be tied to each other. And I think that's what brought me into Pan-Africanism, that if, you know, art doesn't leave you untouched. And so if I'm going to take this charge that the art that I have consumed has placed on me to make my world even slightly better, then I have to realize that I can only make it better in concert with the rest of the continent with which I'm in this predicament in, you know. So I think that was my beginning, because yes, these are separate places. Yes, they have their own particularities, separate ethnic groups. Even in one single country, there's separate, very different people and experiences. But the way that history has worked is that so much of what has happened before is so linked throughout that it's almost like pieces of a puzzle. You can't see one whilst ignoring the other and think that you have a full picture of what's happening and what can be done. And so for me, sorting out what's happening in Kenya means sorting out what's happening in Nigeria, and also realizing the connections that has with our people elsewhere. elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in Haiti, because these are almost the same lines. If we could have like a blackboard and draw a map of what's happening, you could see the lines across all these places. And that for me is what brought me to my Pan-Africanism, I think.
And you, Jenny Stephanie, you started out studying law,
Mm-hmm.
and then went into African studies generally, and then you've come to politics. And I'm just curious, because you're also talking about not just bringing in people, but also looking at how all these disciplines are speaking to each other. Tell me more about that.
It was almost similar to the journey with art. You study one thing and you realize that it's not enough. You study law and then you realize law is in communication with so many other things that the picture I have in my mind is incomplete, which is why I chose a degree as general as African studies, because that gave me history, it gave me literature, it gave me international law, it gave me gender studies. And so I start to kind of see the connections in this bigger puzzle. And so it's almost like just trying to understand. It's my journey into trying to understand what's happening and what can be done. And so what leads me to the PhD is that this is 4 years to think. You know, it's just 4 years to take the time to go as deep as possible to what's going on, to think as deeply as possible into what can be done. And so the nature of PhDs is that they allow you to think multidisciplinarily, and that is what I need and what I have always needed. So I moved from law into African studies into 4 years of just let me think, you know, so that's what brings me here.
And you know, it's interesting the way you said that, because number one, we keep coming back to this thing of action is based on this place of intellectual labor, you know, taking time to think and to work it out and to decide, but also that in this big complexity, and I'm coming to all of you again, what you've talked about is just how complex this thing called Pan-Africanism is. And that's what we've been exploring. Many ideas, many concepts, many issues, many problems, many challenges, and people picking the one thing or the group of things that they want to work on and why they think that these things are important enough to work on. So I'm going to invite all of you just to tell me about what your priorities for this moment and today, where you're standing. What are the priorities that you're working in? I know you've talked about the arts, media, activism, the academy as spheres of working. But just, Mkawasi, if I can start with you, for example, I know you've also done a lot of work in terms of advocacy and activism, especially on this question, both in your writing, in your storytelling, as you've told us, about the relationship between these historical and contemporary communities, if I may put it that way, who are in diaspora, but also between what's going on in the continent and what's going on in diaspora. So what are the priorities that for you govern the work that you do in the present day? And if you want to say a little bit more of where you are, what the specific institution or whatever it is, what you're doing now, but what are the priorities for the moment for Pan-Africanism?
Okay, so where I am right now is still as a storyteller. I write plays and direct them, and also as a teacher, instructor. I run workshops, and these workshops are geared towards opening the door for foreigners who are going to Africa. And then there is the other aspect of the social angle. I really invested in opening the doors for Africans in Africa to make connections and inroads to the African American community, and hopefully others who are in the presence of other African diasporas can do the same. But because I'm in the U.S., I'm more in touch with the African American community. I'm looking for ways in which the stories I tell or the projects I do can bring these groups together, at least have a sustained conversation. Because there's one thing I've realized, when coming from Africa, you do not have this concept of you as a Black person. Now, the African identity, which I talked about at the beginning, is different from the Black identity. Because you come here as an African, you know you're an African, but somebody calls you Black, and it takes you aback. And you know, what does that mean? I've never been called Black before. Of course, it has, for you as an African, it has nothing to do with skin color. And you suddenly begin to learn your identity as a Black person as it relates to the economy, the social stratification, and your political placing in the world. And you realize, this is what it means. There is still a lack of understanding of each other. And that is creating the rift that makes it easy for the more powerful worlds to continue taking advantage of Black people and the Black identity. Let me just say a very quick way in which I understand the stratification of the Black identity. So, which to me is the Pan-African identity. So you have the social identity of the Black person, the social Black. And this is the identity of being connected to Africa. So everybody who is a descendant of African is Black. Now, whether you say, okay, we do not want this conceptualization because we're not the ones that started it, or because it only exists because whiteness exists. Beside that, this identity tells us that if you are somebody who's a descendant of Africa, then in essence, you belong to the Black race. And then you've got the economic identity. Now, the minute you become aware of yourself as a Black person on this globe, in this space, then you must confront your identity in the economic space. The Black person is economically sees themselves a lot as the inferior person, because every time you ask yourself, then why is it that as a Black person, I'm the poorer person, I'm the oppressed person, I'm the dispossessed person? I'll tell you a story. Immediately Trump got into power, I have friends who used to be Trump dumb. I mean, they were strongly pro-Trump. And I got into an argument with one of my Kenyan friends, and he said that there is nothing that ever came out of Africa that is good, that is civilized by Africans. And if there's anything civilized and good that came out of Africa economically, or an invention, it's because it was influenced by Western powers. Now, for me, there was no changing his mind. There was no amount of telling him the history of Africa pre-intervention that would change his mind, which means this. It'll take a few history lessons to debunk that lie, but it'll take a generation to shift paradigms. So there's that economic identity as Black people. You have to confront why being Black is equated to the oppressed, to the depressed, to the dispossessed. And of course, there's a reason why. When you have to go back all the way back to slavery. And then the third one is the identity of the Black person from a political perspective, the political Black, which is the most complex right now, because there isn't a Black nation. There isn't a United States of Africa. And we can see different ways in which African governments and even the AU has been trying to create inroads or create a space, a global space, where there's something like almost like you can say a political Pan-Africanism. I do not know if this will ever be a possibility. Academicians will always say, some academicians will say, no, don't think of Pan-Africanism as an entity, as a political entity. That think of it as regions of Africa that can work towards their own well-being. So my place is taking these three identities and beginning to make them aware, beginning to make ourselves aware as Africans that these are things we share with other people, other African people. We have a Black population here that has been here for centuries. And we are the same people socially because we are the same race. We may not be the same people culturally. We may not be the same people politically. There are Americans, there are Black people in India, the city, who have been there for centuries. There are Black people in Latin America. They're different, but we share one thing, that identity as a Black race. And if we become aware of that, then we begin to become aware of our connectedness. If I can do that through storytelling, it's what I'll continue doing. Eventually, I always say, If you can love one extra Black person, just love one extra Black person, not from your community, not your brother or your sister, but somebody else in whatever way, make a new friend. Then you begin to make those inroads, those connections, and you begin to understand other people in different ways.
Wow, that's a really amazing thing. And you make me think, when I was in Australia, somebody said to me, "You're not Black, you're African." And I thought, what? Because there the Black identity is with the people who people call Aboriginal, the Kuri and Murri people. And so that sense of why are they termed Black? I know if you go to the UK where Stephanie is, Black, it can also be read as a wider people historically, people of Asian descent, people from the Middle East have also been subsumed into that. And then, of course, the term African is also loaded. I know friends of African descent who prefer not to use the term African, say that's for you guys on the continent. So you've raised us a whole number of issues, but that clarity of your priority, as I'm hearing, is education. We've really got to know more about each other. We've got to work better at connecting with each other, no matter where we are, and the shared things that we face. Uduak, if I may come to you, Fearless is the name of your new podcast. And I know you're doing a whole number of things. We've talked about journalism, but you're a communication consultant, you're a coach, you're a mentor. There's so much else that you're doing. What are your priorities for this moment?
Wow, that's it's a big question. I think the thread that runs through everything that I'm doing really has to do with amplifying, elevation, getting us to be our best selves, and you do that through mentoring, you do that through coaching. And all of it is focused on the public interest. Now, how you define the public, wherever you are, whether you're on the continent, whether you're abroad, it can be, a very wide definition of public, but really in the greater good. So within the context of journalism, and you will know that I stepped away in 2017, just to, rest, clear my head. But within the context of journalism, it is, bearing witness. Journalism has been such a privileged space for me because I have witnessed history. I covered, the birth of South Sudan as a nation. I covered the referendum. I covered the election. I've covered 2 Ghanaian elections. And so I remember, this essay that came out about Afropolitans, those of us who find ourselves in one place and then, all of a sudden you want kelewele, you want to eat something different from another country, or you hear, some music and you know immediately what that is, or you're wearing something different and you and, somebody else exchange a look because you understand the context of, you're not quite wearing Ankara, you're wearing Kanga, there's a difference, and so when it comes to Pan-Africanism, for me, when I think about the work that I do with young people, whether it's the mentoring or the coaching, or even something like Fearless, it really has to do with, you talked about Haiti. I would love to see Africans donating, mobilizing for Haiti. Okay, I don't know why it's rocket science to us. Okay, Haiti occupies our imagination as Pan-Africanists, as the first, Black nation to claim independence. So if that's the case, why has it been so difficult for us to put Haiti on a pedestal? Okay, recognizing what Haiti has suffered for its independence, the reparations, everything that has happened. Why haven't we mounted a campaign as Africans, as the African Union, to ensure that those payments stop and that Haiti is reimbursed? Okay, when you look at sub-Saharan Africans being enslaved on the continent and sold, trafficked and enslaved, okay, and governments sitting on their hands. One, they're the cause of people, who will risk their lives to get to the West. And then when Africans, people like you and me, our children, find themselves stranded in the wrong hands we sit on our hands, you know? So the example of Rwanda, where it says, okay, fine, we will take these people. Or, you know, the Nigerian who chartered a plane to get people out of Libya. The Nigerian who chartered a plane to get Nigerians out of South Africa when the xenophobic violence flared up again. That, for me, is what each one of us should be doing. And so that is a priority for me, getting people conscientized, but also acting, you know, in the best interest of people of African descent. When George Floyd is murdered with the eyes of the world on him, and it takes the African Union days to mobilize to say something, okay? That for me is heartbreaking. That is an indictment of us, all right? Whether they see themselves as, you know, African or not, if people are of African descent, they have a claim to Africa. And my hope would be that beyond the financial rewards of African Americans journeying to West Africa and standing and taking pictures at the door of, you know, of no return or whatever it is, that all of us would see to it that if someone of African descent from India, from Latin America, from North America, rocks up to the continent and says, I want to settle here, that we ought to be able to say, actually, you're one of the ones who, you know, went away. And so, yes, here is your diaspora visa. It's not rocket science. It should not be complicated. Western countries do this for each other. You know, if you can claim that, you know, your great-grandparents were from here, you get a passport. Why can't we see that? So, you know, you talked about Fearless, the podcast, it's, you know, connection, conviction, you know, and courage. And for me, I think it takes all three for us on the continent to begin to embrace, you know, those of us who are scattered outside. And they have a choice about how they embrace, whether they engage, but we at least should provide that space. I think we have a responsibility to do that. And I think the different pieces, the different expressions of my professional, you know, talents point in that direction.
Thank you, Uduak. And I want to invite you and indeed all of our panelists to please put in the chat so that everybody can begin to engage, or, you know, any work that you're doing. Uduak has just launched the podcast, Fearless. Mkawasi, I know you've done some writing on some of this. So please, I'm inviting you to put any of those links as we continue to have our conversation. Stephanie, I'm going to come to you and just a little bit more about your research. Uduak has talked about, you know, we need to be fearless. We need to take courage and do the things that need to be done. And you said, okay, hang on, I'm thinking about it and trying to work out a few things. Tell me more about your master's. You're doing a master's at the moment, heading towards a doctorate in what? How does this contribute to our big picture?
Okay, so yeah, I'm the MRes, yeah, so it's a master's in research, and then the PhD starts in September officially. Well, I mean, it started with this puzzle about statehood and whether we have the best case scenario at the moment, and which is why when I first saw the theme of these conversations, I was really excited, because I've always wondered if we can think beyond statehood, and if we can think beyond at least the current form of statehood, and if potentially federal statehood or other forms of polity might be interesting. So that's where my research started. But then right now, really, where I'm getting at, which is why I think I'm just thinking, is really at the core of it, what I'm looking for is freedom and justice, and what kind of setups can best achieve freedom and justice for Africans. And so that animates all my work. And it reminds me of this quote by Amilcar Cabral about, you know, what people want is just the material ability, material goods. You know, it's not about people not fighting for ideas. People are fighting for the material basics that they need, and improvements of livelihood. And so I think about how can I best make my research useful in thinking about how we strategize for improving the livelihoods of our people. So it's not to support any kind of ideology or theory. I'm not going to be bound to theory at the expense of people. And so it's very exploratory at the moment. I'm thinking through as many options as possible. I'm thinking about what statehood means, what it could mean in future, what federal statehood might mean, what not having statehood might mean. So it's just very many, exploring as many possibilities as possible that tie in with some of the priorities that I think we need to have at the moment, which is securing those basics for our people, making sure, if we need to do the Black Panther type of thing with having food programs, breakfast programs for our people, just securing the basics for our people. And then second of all, realizing what's happening. I think in one of the conversations that you had previously, somebody mentioned being tired of all this talk about colonialism. And then I think it was Horace Campbell or somebody else, or it might have been Brian, who said that you might get tired of it, but then you need to realize you're still in it. You're still within that colonial moment. It's just neocolonialism now, and it's cleaner. It looks cleaner. It looks less bloody, but it is still what's happening. It's just being negotiated more cleverly. And so if we uncover what's actually happening at the moment, realize that things are still going wrong and horribly wrong, then my thesis, I hope, shed some light on what's happening, and then also possibly start to think about, again, in one of those previous talks, somebody mentioned the idea of the United States of Africa was threatening, realizing that some of our dreams will be threatening and how to secure them anyway, and how to make sure that despite the threats, we still have ideas on how we could possibly counteract them in the future. So it's just, again, an exercise in thinking and tying in our priorities to my thesis, I think.
Stephanie, what makes me excited about your work is that, as I said, a lot of these big projects come out of thinking, and you're not afraid to take on the big institutions, to take on the big questions, to push us further. We started this series by looking at some of the concepts and the people who dared to dream and dared to theorize and dared to give us an intellectual framework. And I think what you're adding to the pot is that there's a lot of intellectual work to be done. And even for people who've said, look, we're done with emancipation, although Udwak has reminded us, we still have people who are enslaved today. Yep. And you're done with colonialism, but now the big debates on decoloniality are on the table, that there's critical work in terms of thinking and research that needs to be done. But then complementing that, Jerry, you have invested your life in activism, both in the local, doing it at the local level, but also bringing many countries together to think about the big issues. Most recently with Greenpeace Africa, when you're thinking about environmentalism, and it was interesting when you talked about how Wangari Maathai inspired you at the beginning, and then you're carrying on that mantle. But also, I know that you sit on boards, international boards. And then now you're doing something with Project 4 Institute. What is Project 4 about? Where do you feel you are at now in terms of these activists, these big projects? And what are the priorities for now that we need to address in the field of advocacy and activism?
Let me unmute. Okay. Wow. This is really interesting, and I must commend you again, and also for the speakers that have been there in the former sessions, because they also inspired me. I know some of them, like Brian, he was my chair at Greenpeace, and others, and therefore, as I was consolidating my thoughts for today, and looking at where I am with Chapter 4 programs and projects. I really felt at home. I really felt that I'm not lost. I'm not doing the wrong thing. The more I listened to the people who were speaking, the more I realized, wow, there are many of us there following different paths, but towards the same goal. So Chapter 4 programs and projects is an organization I had registered in 2015, but the important thing about it is that it is named after the Bill of Rights chapter in the Constitution of Kenya. It is under chapter 4. And I had thought that we had done so much work to make sure that we had a good Bill of Rights. And it is so easy for people to forget that you have a very good constitution, but more importantly, a very good Bill of Rights, which anchors the rest of the constitution. So that is what I thought, wow, let this be my kind of side job, not a side hustle, maybe a side hustle. But even as I continue to do the normal human rights and environmental work, what can I do with chapter 4? And one of the things that I'm doing right now is what I call mentorship, personal development and leadership courses for community leaders, for human rights defenders, for journalists, and for women who want to vie for political positions and all that. But Mshai, for what I'm saying to make sense, I want to share some statistics, because when I looked at those statistics, I got a bit shocked how badly off we were doing as a continent, and how indeed more of us need to be rescuing this continent. We need to be all putting our energies and our resources and our minds and our intelligence or energy. If you are an energy person, put the energy, whatever it is, to really, really move us from where we are. Let me share some of these statistics to anchor indeed where chapter 4 is at. On the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, they are UN goals. Every country, including Kenya, participated. Many countries in Africa participated in making sure that these development goals were put in place. So even if they're UN, they concern us as Africa. By 2030, only 11 of Africa's 54 countries, they talk about 54, are projected to be able to eliminate extreme poverty, according to World Data Lab. Throughout the rest of the world, it has been forecasted that only 12 other countries will fall short of target. So the same number of countries the only countries that will make it in Africa is the number of countries that won't make it in the rest of the world. So it's like, so that means we are not winning this one. Yeah, that's the first one. If we go at the pace we are going, we are not changing from where we are. And most of these countries are in North Africa or in the islands. These 11, they're either in North Africa or in the islands. Then a few population statistics. The current population of Africa is 1.3 billion plus, yeah? This is by Monday, August 16th, 2021. So this is the most recent, this is UN estimates, the most recent 1.3 billion Africans. Africa's population is equivalent to 16.72% of the total world population. So it's quite a big group, quite a big number. And Africa ranks number 2 among regions of the world, roughly, ordered by population. So we are among, of the continents, we are the ones who are second in terms of population. I think we all know the first one must be Asia. 61% of Africans live in informal. Now this for me, now I start to get even more worried, Mshai. 61.8% of Africans live in informal settlements, let's say slums. And if we add the rural poor, the number is approximately 72%. Now, if I look at that 72% against our 1.3 billion, it means 991 plus million people are living in slums in Africa. Whether it's in rural areas, a hut that is falling, a place that has no sewage, has no water, that is the majority of citizens of Africa. Now, at least in 6 countries in Africa, over 80% live in slums. At least 80%. And that is, I don't have to mention the countries, but at least 6 of them are over 80% of the population live in slums. So my next My next one is on youth population. And here I pose a question which also will be part of the discussion that we are going to have. I hope we are going to have before we finish this. In Africa, 60% of the population is below the age of 25. And the median age in Africa is 19.7 years. So 19.7, so 1920, that is majority of Africans at that age. In Kenya, it's 75% is under 35 years. So that's quite a huge number. I just took Kenya because now 54 countries was a bit much. Africa has the youngest population in the world, and Africa's youth population is rapidly growing and expected to double to over 830 million by 2050. So just the young people now alone, without the, the rest of us, will be over 830. The World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions see this population as a problem, the population growth. They see the numbers as a problem because there are too many mouths to feed. But my question is, and if there are young people listening in, is this a ticking time bomb or an opportunity for Africa, this youth? But now I have some very interesting statistics on women, because, you know, women, I've discussed the youth, and I want my discussion and what we are doing in chapter 4 to anchor around mainly the youth and the women, yeah? In Kenya, majority of new jobs are created in the informal sector, as evidenced by a survey conducted by Kenya National Bureau of Standards in 2019, where 840,000 jobs created, 762 were from the informal sector. This accounts to 90.7% of total employment. Mshai, I'll repeat there because I'm not sure whether I was very clear. Of the 840,000 jobs created, this was by the Kenya National Bureau of Standards in 2019, and this could be between maybe 2018, 2019 there. 762 of them were from the informal sector. Mm. And that is 90.7%. And I know there are many intellectuals, many highly educated people listening to this. I want you to swallow that the informal sector is employing 90.7%, while the formal sector, the highly educated, the ones now on Webner, us people, we are employing less than 10%. Less than 10%. So in recent years, the government has taken steps to oversee the growing. And I'm thinking these statistics in Kenya could be the statistics in Nigeria, could be the statistics in South Sudan, could be the statistics elsewhere. In recent years, the government has taken steps to oversee the growing number of Chama groups. We call them Chama, the women groups. Now, note these statistics also. Chama groups are over 300,000, and most of them are women-led. Now, they are managing a total of Kenya shillings 300 billion, these chamas. That is approximately, for those who are not Kenyans, 3.4 billion US dollars. These chamas, these women informal groups of women are managing 3.4 billion US dollars in assets. Now, this informal sector that is raising this much money, that is employing this many people, they have little or no education, they have no access to finance, they have no economic opportunities and women empowerment economic programs like workshops, because, you know, usually they are there busy from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. They're working, nobody calls them for meetings, for education, for empowerment. And they have no access to markets and work sites. Sometimes they are being harassed by police every day. They are running with their wares every day. But despite all that, they are producing that much money and they are employing that many people. Why did I want to concentrate on these two sectors, the youth and the women? It's mainly because, and I want to share also some of my African sheroes. I have 5 of them, and I added the 5th after listening to some of the webinars that you have been holding. What I saw here is a lot of power in women, a lot of power that has not been acknowledged, that they are not even aware. They are not even aware. They don't know these statistics. So they're not even aware that they're actually holding the economies of countries. They are not aware. Then the other one is the youth are not aware that there are so many and that they live in informal sectors, most of them, settlements, and that they are misused by politicians. And therefore, the governments we have in Africa are by this sector. Because if you look at the votes, if 72% live in informal settlements and they are young, many of them, maybe 60% are young, of that 72%, then they are the voters. So the governments we have in Africa are defined by this group. And the money we have in Africa is defined by the women. But we don't know, and they don't know. So before then I come to my argument, let me just talk about these sheroes. And I want to speak specifically about two or three of them, and it's important because I'm going back into history. And I want us to see this power did not just happen today. It has been there. And we have not acknowledged it because somehow when patriarchy came, which is a new thing, it wasn't there in past years. Women were powerful and they led and they did things. And so let me speak about King Pavita of the Congo.
Okay, and Jerry, I'm going to encourage you as you do that, if you could be as brief as possible, just because we have questions and then we'll need to start winding up. But go ahead, go ahead. We have King Pavita.
Let me speak of King Pavita of the Congo. They call her the mother of the African Revolution. She tried to unite the Congo and was killed. She was called a heretic and she was burned. Let me go back to a familiar woman we all know. Majority of Christians will know, majority of Muslims will know her. The Queen of the South, she's called the Queen of Sheba from Ethiopia. She was a queen. She ran as a queen for 50 years. She was managing a state in Ethiopia for 50 years. And that is before Jesus Christ. So many years before. So what do I want to say? Let me just conclude there and say these two women take us back in time because King Pavita was 1600 something. They take us back in time. So when we are looking at the way forward for Africa, we cannot look at the way forward by ignoring women anymore. And women cannot ignore themselves. They must acknowledge their power. We must realize that the youth of this continent are the power force we have to drive this continent. And we must also realize that if we leave the informal sector as informal, as uneducated, as ignored, we will continue to have the kind of governments that we are having now. So for chapter 4, that's where we are working with communities, try to get them change that mindset, try to get them out of that shell, working with women leaders, working with women in informal settlements so that they can realize who they are. And maybe majority of Africans in that case will know who they are. Let me end there for now.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And one of the things that you remind me of, I think it's Horace Campbell who brought into our conversations this idea of Pan-Africanism is about making sure everybody is living out the fullness of their humanity. And so it is important for us to make sure that every single person, especially these groups and communities that have been marginalized by all sorts of people and forces and structures, are able to live up to that potential. And thank you for especially highlighting those three. I'm going to, at the end of it, ask all of you guys to tell me this question. So start thinking about it. If there is one thing our generations, the current generations of Pan-Africanism, are to achieve by the year 2075, so that we can say we're done, let's move on to the next one, what would it be? But before I do that, I just want to go to some of the questions. We've had a great number of questions that have come in. And so I just want to quickly ask, and you all don't have to respond to every question, just as long as we get a response from somebody. I think one of the first questions that came on was from Izuchukwu Echesirim, who said, I do agree that thinking is a critical part of building the theories and framework of Pan-Africanism, but at what point do we stop? Or how do we navigate through the feeling that we may never know enough to act? A number of you have talked about finding out, looking for, doing the research. But Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I specifically want you to start answering that question. Another question that has come up and is on this question of, I think this one will go to Njeri. It would be good to know which one of the 6 countries of the 80% you mentioned live in slums. How else can we know where the problem lies? So maybe, Njeri, I'll come back to you. And I think that's a bigger question on data. But then here's one that I want to address to both Mkawasi and Udwak. The rest of you also feel free, but I'll start with you too. And this is on the question of Mkawasi. I appreciate the mention. These are anonymous. That's why I'm not telling you who has asked it. I appreciate the mention of the disconnect between Africans on the continent and those on the diaspora, especially shaped by access to knowledge systems on education. What are your views on the educational systems across global Africa? Are we anywhere close to developing systems that adequately equip our people to understand the complexities of our identities as Africans, Blacks in the diaspora, and so on? How are we educating continental Africans about our own positive histories and that of Africans in the diaspora? What do African Americans, but generally Africans who are not living on the continent, know about contemporary Africa? We cannot foster a common Pan-African front if we are ignorant of each other. And I want to say, by the way, the 8th Pan-African Forum specifically focused on education. So you might also want to go and look that one up. So I'm going to ask Udwak and Mkawasi to come to that question. But Stephanie, may I start with you?
So I think there's 2 things here. So when do we stop thinking? Never. We never stop thinking. And also, I think thinking is particularly important, or how to, we need to learn how to think. And I'm thinking about Binyavanga and how he said we need to start to think beyond the syllabus. And I don't know if this is just a Kenyan thing or if it's a thing everywhere else or in many places. But Binyavanga talks about how in school, when you start to ask a question that's outside the syllabus, you're quickly told that's outside the syllabus, that's beyond the syllabus, go back, retreat, go back to the things that you're supposed to be thinking about. So when we think about thinking, we need to start to think beyond the syllabus, to destroy the syllabus, to start to imagine more. So I think the work of thinking is crucial and we never stop doing it. But then we also will never know enough to the point that we are like, okay, now we are done. We will never know enough, which means that we go back again to the thought that we need to remember this is all for people. This is all to improve the lives of people. And so those people must always be at the center of all our work. So it's not that, we take all this time and thinking and people are not eating, people are being killed. We need to also do the immediate actions that satisfy the basic goods that secure life. And so I think it's things that we do in tandem, it's simultaneous things. So we think we do, neither stops at one point and the other takes over, they continue at the same time. So even when we have solutions, we'll have to think if we have new information that makes us improve upon those solutions. And so it'll be a continuous cycle, I think, yeah.
Jerry, and the other question that has come just straight based on what you also asked was if you could repeat the name of the queen. I know, thank you, Udwak. We've put that link into the chat. But Jerry, the name of the 17th century, I know you know, let just repeat the two names again so people can catch them. And then the question on where can we get the data that you were referring to? Okay.
First of all, they wanted to know the 6 countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to send to you this presentation, Mshai, with all the references, so you can post it to the relevant channels so that people can see. But they wanted to know the 6 countries, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the first country is the Central Africa Republic. 93.3% live in slums. Sudan, 91.6%. Chad, 88.2%. Sao Tome and Principe, 86.63%, Guinea-Bissau, 82.3%, and Mozambique, 80.3%. So those are the population figures of people who live in slums. And I'm going to send everything with the reference so that it can be, so that everybody can be able to check it out. The Queen of the South is the Queen of Sheba, made famous by her endearing mention in the Old Testament as the Queen of the South, who came from the uttermost parts of the earth, and who referred to herself, Mshai, this is important, she referred to herself as being very dark, but comely, and in other versions as being black and beautiful. And she was part of the dynasty founded by Zabesi Agabo in 1370 BC. And she apparently ruled the Ethiopian kingdom for more than 50 years. This story, on possibly one of the most famous African women, tells a powerful story about rulership, respect, and equality. Let me end there so that people can answer. I think those are the 2 questions to me, yeah?
Yes, and I'll come back. I think I can see another one coming up. But first, let me go to Udwak and Kawasi on education in all our various spaces. Udwak, may I start with you, please?
I think myself.
Yeah.
Yes, so look, this is an interesting question and one that I have grappled with and continue to grapple with. It's important, and the person who asked this question makes a very important point. And what is our experience of education, on the continent and outside the continent as pertains to Africa and people of African descent? It's a dismal one. Okay, we don't learn about each other. For most of us, we're still learning, and education in all its forms, we're still learning from books that were written by outsiders. Okay, we have failed in our imagination of what education should look like, how it should serve us, particularly when we talk about Pan-Africanism. So for instance, for most of our countries, let's take, for instance, the 6 countries that Jerry has just mentioned, our public health systems have failed. And so families with means send their children to private schools, or they send them abroad. Okay, what sort of education are they learning? You have children who, in terms of race, in terms of cultural, expression, are African, who know nothing about Africa. Couldn't name you a river, a lake, an African queen, an African king, couldn't do any of that. But they can tell you about the history of Europe, and they can tell you about the history of the Americas. I used to be one of those children because, of course, I, was always traveling. The African Union has failed us again in terms of what a Pan-African curriculum would look like. Think about the number of international schools we have on the continent, where some of us send our children, okay? So even just, being able to say that it doesn't matter whether you're the German school or the French school, as long as you're in school in Africa, this is this is what you will learn about Africa and what is age appropriate for you. If we were to go to their schools, that's what we would be learning. because we're, on European soil, but we haven't done that for ourselves. If you think about the different forms of education, whether formal or informal, okay, how many of us even know ourselves as Africans, are even acquainted with, some sort of Pan-African ideology or philosophy? We're not. Okay, and so when we talk about, educating ourselves, the person who asked the question talks about our positive contributions. I disagree. I have trouble with, positive stories and positive this. I think that we have to reflect the fullness of who we are, our identity, what we have done, what we have not done, how we think, how we have failed to think. All of that complexity must be reckoned with. We fail to reckon with ourselves. And so the question that Stephanie was responding to about thinking is important. And it's not a binary question about thinking, you stop thinking and then you act. We need people to continue thinking. We need people to continue acting. We need people to continue the reflection. Okay, we need people to sit back, review. We need all of these things happening at the same time, in tandem with each other. To put it, colloquially, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We don't need to stop one thing so that the next thing can begin, and then when the next thing doesn't begin, we're stuck. Okay, and my sense is that is the point of these conversations, so that we can take stock of what we're doing in our little corners and communities. We can inspire others to think about themselves, their gifts and what they can do, how they can contribute, and, see where that takes us. But my challenge to everybody, I guess, would be to, because sometimes we can be quite passive, about waiting for somebody to, educate us when, if you look hard enough, as Jerry did when she was sharing that data, you will find the knowledge that you're seeking. There are some of us who could make it easier, but that knowledge exists.
Thank you. Thank you, Uduak. Mkawasi?
All right, real quick. To answer the question on education, I would say the education we've received so far is poison. It has completely poisoned us as Africans. It has not taught us who we are, and it is a system. Remember, these are education systems that we inherited from the British, from the colonial powers, and they were geared towards making tools, creating tools out of human beings for the crown. Now, the crown was replaced by the governments, and the kind of thing the government tells us is that they want an education for the markets, so that what you are as a human being, as a student, is just a cog in the wheel that is supposed to cater to the markets, as opposed to an education system that makes you enlightened as a citizen. So it's only now, we are just at the nascent stages of intellectuals who are beginning to question and push back against the education system as it is right now. So it is important right now to absolutely question each African country, to absolutely question their education systems, because it is not theirs. They were not created for our own good. Mm-hmm. And then the other aspect of the education system that I've discovered is that the church is a major institution in educating us Africans on who we are, our identities, and it has done a dismal job of it. Let me give you an example, and this is a completely shameful confession to make. I told you about the story that we were telling back in the 90s called Pambazuka, Africa. And in the play, we were exploring, there's a character who's explaining why Africa, why we were experiencing the things we're experiencing in Africa. And the explanation is that we were cursed. That the curse of Ham and the children of Ham is what we inherited as Africans. I mean, come on now. We believe this. We believe this because we were taught this by our churches, by whoever it was that brought this down on us. This is a philosophy that destroyed South Africa And it's a philosophy that was inherent in our churches, and we believed it. It took me getting out of Kenya to completely remove that part of the play. So we were spreading poison to audiences that never questioned this part, telling ourselves that we are cursed. And another thing which is common, you can see it even now. You have well-educated people of the cloth who preach about how cursed we are by God. And I remember clearly one pastor coming to Nairobi Pentecostal Church and telling us how we are a pagan nation as Kenyans, as Africans, and that God's beloved country is Israel. And so we ought to think about our paganness and repent our sins and our place as Black people. And you see people leaving the church carrying this with them. So we have the church as an institution of teaching us an educating us on who we are in a very poisonous way. And up to now, you can still see that mindset of we Africans as people who need to repent our own cursed place by a certain deity for whatever sins we've committed. Now, when it comes to, what I'm saying is we have to confront this. We have to confront the lies. We have to confront our own education systems, and we have to support those who relentlessly confront this. When it comes to our awareness of each other as Black people and Africans across the world, Black people in the US have been poisoned against Africans. We Africans have been poisoned against the Black people. You see a new generation of Africans coming to the US with the idea of Black people as thugs. You know, these are people who are just out in the streets. Why is Freddie Gray and George Floyd getting killed? That is because they are just Black people who are jobless and they have nothing else to do. You know, and this is what young people are coming here with. My generation, I've got to say, I think we had a different sense of sensibility because we didn't go through the MTV education. So we weren't aware of that negative aspect. But when we came here, we learned other things as well. When we come here, Black people have also think about Africans as, oh, are you really like that? Because these are questions I've gotten as well. Are you really like that? And you have to interpret what really like that means. You know, are you really that destitute, and that do you still really just live in a shack, you know, with the toilet where you just, you know, throw whatever out of the window in plastics? These are education things that we have to confront. And how do we confront that? Through a sustained conversation. This is one of them. How do we think about, one thing I've got to say is that I'm completely optimistic, and what makes me optimistic in this area is the new generation. They have a kind of they've come up with a social Pan-Africanism that is absolutely refreshing. They do not have these boundaries. When you look at the music they're producing, when you look at you know, their fashion, their movies, you look at Nollywood, you look at what some of the things being produced by Riverwood in Kenya, the culture that is being produced by these young people is an African culture. It's amazing. They are crossing the boundaries. They do not care about those geographical areas, boundaries. And it is this is why I'm saying it's absolutely refreshing to see a generation that has a sense of social Pan-Africanism that is growing, that is just seems to be growing naturally. And I think this is a consequence of globalization. And I would hold on to the tales of our children to guide us into a new sense of a Pan-Africanism that gives us fresher identities of who they are, of who we are. You know, so the young Blacks in the US are more familiar in a more positive way of Blacks in African countries because of the culture that they're sharing through the new medias.
Hey
I hope
guys,
I've answered your question. Thank you.
I'm dying because I want the conversation to go and we are over time. But I'm going to talk about a sustained conversation, how we're going to sustain these conversations past this, which was supposed to be the last of our panel conversations in this series. And, you know, it's just started up a whole new fire. What I'm going to do is to come to each one of you and ask you to answer my question by 2070 or 2075, right? What is it that we are all going to put our energies into saying we must, you know, think through the big picture now, our generation of Pan-Africanists, the same way, you know, one generation once said emancipation of all enslaved people. We're not quite there completely yet, but that's been largely achieved. Another generation said independence. Okay, so now we're working through the question of getting out all the colonial frameworks, but we are there. What would our generation have been achieved? And as we're doing that, I'm going to ask Stephanie, there's a question that's been addressed to you specifically. If you could just say a little bit more about this idea beyond statehood or nation states in light of the wider geopolitical push with regard to globalization. So I'll come to you third, you know, as we are finishing, and also how that relates to the principle of small government. And then Jerry, as you're answering, and I'll come to you fourth so that you have a way, you know, you can think through a little bit more of this, which means Udwak and Kabasi, I'm coming to you next. Your question would be, Jerry, how are African countries dealing with climate change and farming? Should African farmers be supported to find communal solutions that increase climate resilience? And this is from Paul Kashiru. So I'll come to Stephanie and Jerry, ask you to give me your big picture, but also say a little bit on those two questions. But Udwak and Kawasi, which ones of you want to give us your words of wisdom to tell us this is what we are working to? I see those smiles.
Who's starting?
You are.
Okay.
And your voice.
I would say this, if this makes sense at all, let's assume that we're going to try and make sense of it. I'm hoping that our generation and the generation that is coming after us especially can help us pick our scattered bones, our scattered selves as Africans, because what has happened, we have a scattered sense of ourselves, and we're not quite sure how to think as one. Because if a Black person comes from Africa, South Africa, Uganda, Nigeria, wherever, and goes to Germany, they'll be treated the same. If they went to the US, if they went to China, if they went to the Middle East, they'll be treated the same because they're Black. So if we manage to pick up these scattered pieces of ourselves and create a sense of unity, we'll begin to think of ourselves as a power that can begin to repair our social, our economic scatteredness, our political scatteredness. The economic scatteredness was so well defined by Njeri, and how powerful we in fact are. Just a 30-second story that my grandmother told me, because it explains this very well. There were two girls. They were sisters, and the father left them a bird and told them, do not let it fly away. And one of the sisters was playing with it too much and it flew away. And the other sister said, oh, I'm going to tell father that you let the bird fly away. When the father came back from a long journey, she said, oh, my sister here let the bird fly away. And the father was very angry and beat her up so bad that her bones scattered all over the place. And the bones, there was a crow that came and picked up those bones and put them in the river. And the sister who told on her sister, the one who betrayed her, would go to the river every day and sing to the bones and hope the bones would come back together. And it's this sense of contriteness that made her go and sit there by the river every day. So this reminds me of the scatteredness of Africans, the fact that the Maafa was a scattering through the waters. And what is it that picked up these bones together? An outside force. The same crow came and picked up these bones one by one because of the cry of the sister and put them together. So we have to think about, what is this outer force that we are looking for to pick up our scattered bones? And I'm thinking about, that's what I'm talking about, the generation that is coming after us. We are the educating generation, so we have to educate them properly in order for them to pick up this scatteredness, in order for them to explain exactly what Njeri is explaining, that the power of our economy is in our women and in our youth. If you pick up these bones and put them together, then we have an idea of actually having a Pan-Africanism that actually works. Thank you.
Wow. Mm-hmm. We will get to that Pan-Africanism that actually works. Thank you very much, Mukawasi. It's been such a pleasure having you on. Udwak.
Thank you, Mshai. Mukawasi, that's a powerful story. And if you were to unpack it further, who scattered the bones? The father did, the sister did. And that's what we've done to ourselves. We've been scattering ourselves. And so I would like to see us give meaning to solidarity, okay? At the moment, it's empty platitudes. And so going back to Haiti, it is that where we see that we respond appropriately, okay? With dignity to challenges that any of us are facing, whether on a corporate level, country, national level, but we just understand what it means to give meaning to solidarity. And my hope is that by 2070, that we will have an updated expression of Pan-Africanism that future generations can align with, so that when their time comes, they can also bequeath to, Stephanie was quoting Aikweyama, I think this is the beautiful ones who are not yet born, that they can read their context and update and revise Pan-Africanism to respond to whatever the context will be in the next 50 or so years.
I really like that because it's about continually building on what has come and continually thinking about the foundation for the future. Udwak, thank you so much. You're fearless in so many different ways. I'm so glad you're doing the podcast, but it's been really wonderful having you on today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephanie, lots of thinking, lots of ideas on the table. So come to what you think, where we're going, but also just if you can say something to Andrew in terms of his question.
Okay, to Andrew's question, I'll quickly say, my research started from these three ideas, or roughly three ideas. One, that African states currently are too small to be viable. And so either we join in like blocks or join federally as a United States of Africa. So that's one stream of thinking. The other stream of thinking is that whatever the African state looks like, and this is from people like Kehinde Andrews, whatever the African state looks like, it's doomed to fail because it's working by remote control. So whoever you put in charge of the African state, nothing is salvageable about the state because it's not working. It's not controlled from here. It's not controlled locally. So do away with it, basically. And there's the other thought of there's possibly other alternatives. So this is closer to the thing that I said about thinking beyond the syllabus. We didn't always have the state as is today in the particular characteristics of the state and what is recognized in international law. So if we thought about a possible other form of polity that could achieve justice for people in better ways, what would that look like? So it's kind of from these three questions or schools of thought that I try to work through my thesis, but of course I'm just starting. And so as the answers come to me, I will share them, but I really don't know where we're going so far, but then I'm thinking. And then in terms of, thinking about globalization, I think, somebody said in the previous sessions that it hasn't been a happy global village, as people like to put it. So think about who globalization benefits and who it doesn't, and whether it's worth it in the end. So just reconciling what globalization has meant with with what we actually want for ourselves, again, putting people at the center, and then we might have better answers. In terms of small government, I think this is entirely dependent on your economic, where you're leaning economically in terms of the systems that you support. And that's a highly controversial area to get into that I will not do in the last minutes of this. But yeah, I think that what you think of small government depends on what you think about economic systems. And also, I'm not an expert in economics. But then in terms of like the dream for where we want to get to, my gosh, I buy into all the dreams that have been stated so far. But also, I think hopefully we return Pan-Africanism to the grassroots, kind of decenter the state in our imagination of what Pan-Africanism means, and return it to, it started among the people. So hopefully by 75, we'll have democratized and localized Pan-Africanism such that all of us can claim ownership, not some big dogs at AU. Pan-Africanism is for the people. And so that I would hope to see a very local recognition, because I think people do live Pan-Africanism locally, but we don't recognize it enough. And just allowing multiple expressions of what Pan-Africanism means at local levels, and possibly still reviving the congresses in some way. I'm not sure if this is just utopian dreaming, but possibly having that local connection with a wider Pan-African type of Congress that reconciles our differences in languages and realities and that kind of thing. But also, like, the very key thing that I want is to assure my people the basic goods. Just everybody has food, everybody has shelter, everybody has clothing. And that, I think, would be enough for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. And, I'm going to just say this, you're the one, I think, who is probably going to carry the torch for us to the next generation. I really, really appreciate that, when we were chatting about you coming on, this sense of, I may still be working my way in, beginning, and, of course, we have Jerry on the other side, who is like, I've been there for several decades and I'm still working. But I really appreciate that you have come on board and you have fired us up, because one of the questions we started out with was, does Pan-Africanism even have meaning for the 21st century? And are people who are born in the last 30 years and coming forward, are they even interested? So thank you for that thing of, no, not only are we interested, we're going to grow a deeper engagement with it. Thank you so much for coming. And Jerry, you had a bit of, yes, you've been taking us through, you've been on this for a long time. So what do you think we will leave as a generation to 2075? But also, if you could just say something, please, to the question that you were asked.
Okay, Mshai, I have just 4 short things. I'll say that there are 4, but I need to say, I think, all 4. Mm-hmm. First of all, let me just respond to the question on the generation. I think I belong to a generation that has already done quite a bit, but that is willing to continue doing, because we have realized, it's a generation that has realized that we are in this for the long haul. It's not a short-term job to be a Pan-Africanist or to be a human rights defender or to be an activist in any way. You are there, once you get in there, you are there for the long haul. Then the other thing I wanted to say, because of the statistics I gave, especially on the women, and the amount of money and jobs they are producing, I just wanted to say that knowledge is power. That's what we always hear, that knowledge is power. But I want to add that knowledge and action is the ultimate power. So if you just have knowledge and you're keeping it there and you're happy just to have the knowledge, you have it, you have a little power. You think you have power, but you have a little power. But when you have knowledge and you are taking action in the areas that you are called upon to, then that is ultimate power. Then I just wanted to say something small about Pan-Africanism, because I didn't quite get a chance to say this. And to be a Pan-Africanist for me is the highest level of political consciousness for a person of African descent, though proud of their ethnicity, because we've already got a history. Though proud of our ethnicity, we do not glorify it of our nation. Though proud of our nation, we do not glorify it of our continent. So we are aware of our roots, we are aware of where we have come from, but we don't over glorify it to undermine the others. So, and somebody in this, in our panel talked about love, spreading love. And that is what it is. And finally, on the question of agriculture and farming, when I was at Greenpeace, there was a program called Food for Life, a very interesting program, but it was just here in Kenya because the other countries concentrated on other things. And they were trying to push for food for everybody, but safe food. It's one thing to have food, but most of the food we have is not safe because of the pesticides, etc., etc. So even though I didn't get the question quite right, what I want, if with just a second of half a minute, I want to give some other statistics on agriculture. Yeah. And this is just, I'll give in Kenya, but it kind of shows when you give one country, and because Africa is mainly an agricultural country, it kind of then reflects, you can use those statistics to see how we are doing. The agricultural sector contributes 33% of Kenya's gross domestic product, and the sector employs 40% of the total population and 70% of the rural population. The sector provides 65% of export earnings. It provides livelihoods to more than 80% of the Kenyan population. So if you can transform this to every other agricultural country, the statistics are likely to be near because, you know, we talked about how majority of us are poor, either running farms or living in slums. So this again needs to be managed well, because if we are feeding, if the agricultural sector is feeding 80% of the population, then it needs to be really well managed. And these people need to be very well paid, because if they withdrew their tools, we would starve. If every farmer withdrew their tools, the continent would starve. So Mshai, I know I don't have much more time, but I just want to encourage us to find our space. I'm in this space. I'm in this space. I've been there. New constitution, political prisoners, everything. I can say I added a little spice there. I added a little spice there, and I'm still adding spice to whatever else is coming. And now I am in this to liberate other African people. We must change our mindset, and I have found the tools, and I'm able to do that. So look for me if you need to change your mindset. Over.
I really do like the way you said that. Look for me if you need to change the mindset, because I think that's such a wonderful way to think about it. Our spice no matter where we go. Thank you, Njeri, for consistently doing that over decades and decades and continuing to do that. We really, really appreciate all that you've given to us here in the webinar today, but also as you continue to give. Let me just thank this wonderful panel. This has been the longest conversation we've had. I know we knew it would be because it was such a big panel, but also because we really wanted this last conversation to try and bring the threads together. And I could go on just talking to you guys for another hour. So thank you, thank you, thank you for the richness of what you have brought. And indeed, I'm not the only one saying it. I do not have time today to go through all the comments that have been given. I'm just going to pick one. Lavinia Mboya at one point just said, "These perspectives, exclamation mark." And then later on, she said, "Thank you all for the insightful discussions." Surafel Abebe also, looks at, a particular comment, but then also ends up by just saying, "Thank you all." Surafel, you really carry that together. And I know Surafel, I know he's sitting in Addis, so it's really great to have somebody in Addis also joining the conversation, given all that is going on and the place that we give to Addis. So let me just say a few things of where we are today. First of all, as I thank these panelists, I just want to thank all the many panelists that we've had, over 10 conversations. It has been the privilege of my life to hold the space for such amazing minds. And you guys, I didn't tell you this when you invited you, but the bar was set high. And I remember somebody saying, "Hey, for that last conversation, are you going to get people who live up, or is it going to be one of those like, when will this conversation end? I've been keeping an eye on the participants and everybody has stayed on. So that, I think it's not just me who's been energized. So thank you, and I thank every panelist who has come all through the 10 different months and the different sessions that we have had. I also want to thank the audiences. I mean, all the audiences, today's, but every single conversation has been so rich. And indeed, it has been your comments, your questions, your suggestions. Right up until today, I see whoever's coming in as analysis has raised a whole other question about the space of religion. And indeed, Kawasi, you brought that in. I got another comment to me directly, so I'm not going to read it out because I don't know if the person wanted it to come up, but they said, oh, we need to talk about this whole new space of Pan-Africanism and theology and what the churches or the church in Africa can learn from the church out there and some of the work that's already beginning. So that's a whole other conversation. So let me thank everyone who has dropped in a question, a comment, who's reached out to us. And let me tell you what our gift as we bring this series to an end. The hosts have decided to collect the different conversations that we've had. We are working on some form of a publication so that you will be both able to go to the archives and listen to everything as you want, but also we want to be able to have something that we can share with you that you can keep, the people like Stephanie who are working on ideas can cite, and we can continue to engage. So the two things that we are requesting, if you haven't yet registered, please send us an email or go to any of our accounts on social media accounts on Twitter or on Facebook. Just look for the elephant.info, Alliance Française de Nairobi, or IFRA Nairobi, and any of them will bring it up either on Facebook or on Twitter. And just ask us to add you to the list. Just tell us I'm interested. Somebody will respond to you, and then we can do a direct message so that your email is not available to everyone. The other request that has also come in is that we just have a final conversation that has no panel, just allows us to talk, to go everywhere and anywhere we want to go for 2 hours, and just hold the space for us to draw the threads together. Please, if you're interested in us doing that, we'll only do that if there really is sustained interest. At the moment, we've had about 3 or 4 requests, and we thought about just doing a small thing. But if you are interested, and if we have enough people, we will do that. So if you're in the chat at the moment or on YouTube, just tell us I'm interested in that, or send us an email or send us a message, and we will be able to just organize that probably within a month. Okay, I can already see that yes to the conversations. Finally, let me thank especially those of you who've stayed on for a 2-hour+ conversation today, and for our hosts, the elephant.info, IFRA Nairobi, and Alliance Française de Nairobi. First of all, for coming up with the concept, for continuing to just make this space available, for all the amazing conversations we've had in the background. Each one of them has been carrying part of the load, but I specifically today want to thank Asita Waters of Alliance Française de Nairobi, has been the one who has been made sure that we turned up for all the meetings. She's the one who has opened the space for us, held it open and closed. It has been such a privilege to start these conversations, sustain them for almost a year, and we promise you, we will keep coming back to you. Let me remind you, as Frantz Fanon said, that each generation, every single one of us who makes up a generation, we are part of a historical mission. And the historical mission of Pan-Africanism for your generation will either be fulfilled or it will be betrayed by what you do. So please join with others in your generation. Let us keep Pan-Africanism alive in this, not just for this century, not just for this generation, but beyond. Because as we do that, humanity itself will thrive. Thank you once again. My name is Michelle Mwangola, and it has been such a privilege to host these conversations. Good night, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are.